Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by PistilWhip. Hope you'll enjoy listening. PistilWhip says, Belated February Parley, is hope a myth? This comic panel crossed my desk semi-recently, and I've been thinking about it. For a bit of context, shenanigans caused Superman to split physically into Kal-El, the Kryptonian, and Clark Kent, the human. This allows a unique bit of introspection. Here's the panel, but it's too small to read for you. I'll read it to you. Kal-El, I hope I'm pronouncing that okay, says, "This is idiotic." Clark says, "This is hope." And Kal-El responds that hope is a myth used to motivate men to do what they cannot. Short of buying the comic, Up in the Sky #4, PistilWhip says, I can't seem to find the next page or panel, but apparently the reply to the line about hope is Clark saying, "You know, pal, you almost say that like it's a bad thing, that hope is a myth used to motivate men to do what they cannot." Hope is a sense of expectation and desire for an outcome. In other words, to hope is to want something to happen or be true. Myth has a number of different meanings. It could be a story that serves to explain a belief or natural phenomenon. For example, the various creation myths that describe how the world began. Some myths are intended to teach a lesson, such as Icarus' hubris leading to his literal downfall. Another sense of the word myth is that of a commonly held belief or tradition with the implication of being false. For example, the myth that searing meat seals in its juices. The purpose of searing meat is to brown it and thus develop its flavor. It seems to me that Kal-El disparaged the idea of hope as a myth in the second sense, that it's, a commonly held belief or tradition with the implication of being false. Clark's reply could be seen as referring back to myths in the first sense, a story that serves to explain a belief or natural phenomenon. That is, hope does not need to be real or true to provide guidance. To evoke a previous turn of phrase, hope is an arrow that guides one's actions. It's the search for something better, even when the present circumstances are unfavorable. At the risk of veering off topic, I think this outlines a natural definition of despair as the absence of hope. It's the cessation of the search for something better. With that lengthy preamble out of the way, I would like to hear the captain's thoughts on hope's myth and the possible intersections thereof. Cool. What a great premise for a parlay. Interesting. So to go back to the initial question, is hope a myth? We're not asking, like, does hope exist? It does. It's more like, is the value of hope like the value of a myth? Or is that fake, basically? For clarification, I think that we should use different words for this parlay. For the sense of a myth as like mythology, like a story myth, and a myth like what you might call sort of a fact myth. I'm going to call the fact myth thing fake. Something that is just fake. We're not going to make up a term for that. I think it will suffice for our purposes to say like the fake news that the sense of the word myth, where it's a commonly held belief or tradition with the implication of being false, that I'm just going to colloquially refer to those as just being wrong in this parlay. So for the purposes of this parlay, myth is going to mean like a mythological story. Does that make sense? So I'd like to return to the question framed as, is the value of hope like the value of myth, like a mythological story? And I think that it is. What I mean by that is that I agree with this idea that hope doesn't need to be real or true to provide guidance. In fact, it isn't. Let me give you a few examples, although I'll warn you, they're depressing examples. The first one is, because they're usually bad advice. The first one is the idea that you should follow your passion. This is something that is told to, well, I shouldn't say us, but I bet a lot of you, certainly to me. And it's not good to enact, but I do think it plays a positive potential role. That's how I think it's similar to hope. The idea of people just powering through concerns like material, mortal concerns because they hold out hope, and that gives them basically superpowers. isn't real in practice, I would argue. But I do think that it serves some inspiring purpose, even though if you follow it literally, I would argue it's bad or literally just not real. It does function, therefore, as a myth, very much like the whole follow your passion thing. Here's my opinion on following your passions. If you are a person who would want that advice, you do not have passions because they do not come before doing the work on a thing, generally. I think that when people are deeply invested in something before they do it a lot, that's not passion. That's attachment. They're doing that because they need to do that thing. They must invest in that thing to sort of hold out or pretend that everything is okay when it isn't. Now, this is not meant to disparage people, but that isn't the same thing as being what I'm going to call passionate about something, which is when you do something first, and then for reasons related to that thing, you could have not done the thing, but you do the thing, and you realize that it's great, and you really, really like it, and you decide to work at it. You don't need it, you want it. I don't think that you can have any positive human experience when you merely need something. To put it a different way, I don't think that human life is good until you have overcome basic needs. It can be adrenaline inducing to overcome those needs, but I think that human happiness comes when the door is opened a little crack and want can trickle in. This doesn't mean that you can't be happy if you lead a very simple life. You might think of it as if you're only fulfilling your need to eat, sleep, and poop, you can't be happy. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that what you see in, for example, the society I live in, is that people have given themselves more needs. They need even more things. They created new problems, and now they have to solve those. There's even more need that must be met, and so there's less room for want. When you're focusing on, eating well, sleeping good, pooping effectively, I said eat, sleep, and poop. You have time to focus on making those things better. There isn't so many needs that you can't let in want. That's, I guess, how I would say it. I think that this is basically how you become happy. You can't directly pursue happiness. It doesn't right, it doesn't work for a variety of reasons. But if you focus on meeting your needs and exceeding them and flourishing, you can flourish. You can add flourishes to your flourishing, and you can do things that will make you happy. So to get back to that's getting slightly off topic, but some inspiring advice since I said some depressing stuff. Okay, to get back on topic, the idea of hope being useful as a myth, you can't literally enact the thing you see when people are talking about hope, but the concept is still useful. That's like the follow your passion thing. You shouldn't literally take that advice. It doesn't work. I don't believe that really exists. Or that would lead you to overly attach to something that you really have no good reason to know whether you like or not. And you'll end up just needing to continue following through with that thing. It won't be about want. In which point, why bother? Why not just do something else that's more efficient? If it isn't about what you want anyway, then do the thing that meets your needs the most. And is that what you're doing? No, probably not. So yeah, it's bad advice. But I do still think that when you see someone popping off, it's inspiring. I don't think that's bad just because the way people talk about that is bad. To put it a different way, this is all very simple. I think that when people talk about um, hope or hard work or again following your passion, the problem actually has nothing to do with like the people they're talking about or the thing they're talking about. It's just people's toxic way of referring to those things that's a problem. And if you take to heart the human resonance of the moment rather than whatever thing people are saying, when people try to take that sublime moment and bind it in words, if you just ignore that and focus on, yeah, this thing this person is doing is inspiring, that is solid and useful in a way. Even though if you try to write down the letter of the law of how that functions, it won't work. Like it's not good. Um, I don't think this is out of the ordinary. I don't think that imagining yourself, popping off and you see an awesome street performer and you imagine yourself doing the thing even though that isn't really an accurate depiction of what it would be like to be really good at that, like they are, I still feel like it serves a purpose. Bringing me to part two, I want to give a few examples of how imagining a thing a certain way doesn't have to shape the way that you enact it. We're often told that you should kind of visualize the way that you want things to go, right? And I don't think that's bad advice. Thinking through the steps of the thing you want to do is really good. Hope then seems kind of bad in that you're meant to just sort of, yeah, it's fine, it'll work out. We need to just hold out hope, even if there are really no reasons. Even if we like can't really do it, we should just hold on to hope, and we'll be able to do it. I'm kind of agreeing with Kal El here. You no, that doesn't that's not good. However, I do think that in visualizing the process for enacting something, you can get a little bit too wrapped up in practical matters and not focus as much on the, again, kind of hard to word, positive feeling of succeeding. And I think that focusing on that is great, very valuable. As an example, a lot of us do imagine things in a way that we don't intend to enact them. The two examples I'll give are intimacy, intimate acts, and the trope of imagining success as being violent. I'll explain the two. It's pretty common for people to have an intimate fantasy of something, physical or romantic or whatever, that they would like to do in their head, and they do want to enact those things. But it's equally common for people to have things in their head that they enjoy imagining, but they don't want to enact. It's common for those things to be simply things the person is embarrassed to enact. But I also think that there are some of them that you genuinely, I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience, I'm not going to tell you about mine, but I have things that I imagine that might be like a nice image in my head, but I don't want to do them. I'm not ashamed to ask for them. I've had partners that I've even told these things. I could do them. I've had the freedom to express them. I have been non-judged for having that thought, but I truly don't want to do it. Like, I do not desire that thing. It's a turnoff for me, if you want to say it that way. There's something about the abstraction that kind of makes it work. Another example of this I'll point to is like sexy anime character stuff is a common place I think this comes up. It's common for people to criticize that the aesthetics of your sexy anime character for being unrealistic, for example. But they're meant to be an abstraction. They're not meant to directly mirror a real person. Now, I mostly dislike a lot of depictions of sexy people in all media. They're just not to my taste. It's not because they're bad necessarily. But just to say that I don't think you would expect them to be the same as in real life. I'll give you a simple example if you're forgive it being rather crude. I, in real life, don't particularly enjoy very broad chested people, whether it's men or women. I just don't. That's not what I'm attracted to. I think there's liking oneself thing going on. I am a relatively slim gentleman, and so for whatever reason, I just tend to be attracted to people that are, you could say, a little bit more petite or slight. It doesn't mean that they, can't have boobs or whatever. It just that I tend to be attracted to people who have generally slightly less body mass in general. I'm not being specific because I really don't feel specific about it. Uh, in anime, though, I often find myself like objecting less to characters that have larger proportions than I would normally like in real life. Now, none of this is like anything other than just my taste. I'm just pointing out that when it isn't something real, suddenly my tastes appear to change slightly. And I think it has to do with a mix of aesthetics and also the fact that it kind of represents something. It goes beyond just what I directly physically like, beyond what I logically enjoy. That's not bad. I don't think that's bad. Just because visualizing things and keeping them concrete is generally good doesn't mean that it's always fake if you like something that you wouldn't enjoy in real life. Again, I think a lot of the time that is because people are kind of embarrassed about that. But in practice, I do also think there are times when we like something in a fantasy that we wouldn't enjoy in real life. Forgive my example of chest broadness as an example of that, but it's the example I have. Another example I mentioned is the violent imagery example. You imagine, popping off at some thing, and it's often, for me anyway, and I know I'm definitely not alone in this, it's quite violent. It's a little edgy, we're doing some magic abilities, I'm D&D charactering it up, doing some spell combos or whatever, which has like not really that much to do with what I would be doing in real life, right? It's not that I have an unrealistic perspective on that thing. I also think very thoroughly about the practical nuts and bolts of the thing I'm going to do. But it's hard not to get excited, to just be thrilled by, a show of will from another person, and to imagine that yourself. Having it be physical, which often means violent or destructive, does help visualize it in a way I don't think is bad, as long as it's separate from real life and coupled with practical, analysis of what the situation would be like. Does that make sense? I know this point's a little weird, but I think it's relevant because this idea that people holding on to hope and toughing it out through a bad situation can be inspiring, can instill hope in us, even though the nuts and bolts of that situation, like, it isn't good to suffer through a situation to like build your willpower. That is not good, in my opinion. But it can still be inspiring in some way. You don't have to literally do the thing, for it to be enjoyable. And just as I might admire somebody who is able to or has put in, long hours at a task, I'm not a person who thinks that it's good that people need to do that. I think it would be great if people could do more in their lives. And it's sad that most people can't, but that doesn't make it lamentable that they have. There can be both. You can want people to have more free time and celebrate the way they did spend the time they had, given their circumstances. Uh, Again, that seems like a total nothing burger now that I've said it that way. But the point I was trying to make is just that it is definitely possible to imagine something in a way that's inspiring without it being, literally the way it would happen in real life. It could even, I would argue with the kind of violence example, be harmful if it were that way in real life. And provided you have the proper grounding, I really don't think that that's bad. This is quite the same as, is it bad to celebrate triumphing in a violent battle royale game when you win? I don't think so. I think that the one of the most fundamental aspects that even a child can fulfill as a human is that they can separate reality from fantasy. And we're not celebrating that we sure did kill those guys. Well, at least I'm not. I don't know about you, but when my friends and I win at a battle royale game or whatever, Apex Legends, we're celebrating because we're complimenting each other. I think like, wow, that thing you did was sick. Like, that was badass that you thought of doing that in that moment and saved us. How awesome of you that you saved us. It's not about like, wow, we sure wrecked those guys. Or if we do say that, it's like a minor thing. You know what I mean? It's not what I'm excited about. So I don't think it's bad to enjoy that because I'm apparently not enjoying the fact that it is violent. That's just a more direct and reactable way to combat people mentally. I don't think that's bad. It would be bad if I like wanted it to be a real physical confrontation, maybe, And the same thing, if people who had been through a war were left with a sense of faith in humanity. But then they thought, oh, people should go through that to gain a sense of faith in humanity. You would suddenly go from thinking that was inspiring to thinking that they're kind of crazy. You don't need to have the same experience to feel the same effect or about the same effect. That is the purpose of narrative and description. It is not necessary, it must not be necessary to inspire people by having them go through the same thing. It doesn't have to be real to them for them to get the effect. And this is where I think hope being a myth in a positive light is a totally valid perspective. To close up, I want to evoke some myths and their effects. I think that people sometimes look at tradition or superstition as being too literal. There was something that I uncovered recently while I was playing around with Turkish coffee. Turkish coffee is something that in my part of the world, it's very uncommon, and it would often not be that traditional, even if you were to find somewhere that would serve it. Turkish coffee is, from a brewing perspective, really interesting in ways we don't have time for now. But what you need to know is that when people brew Turkish coffee, they generally leave the coffee grounds in. It's not filtered. Now, if you've ever made coffee by just taking ground coffee and putting some water on top of it, you know that it sinks. So it's okay to drink it that way. It's not hard to drink it like that. If you try to drink it dry, yeah, it's a bit silty at the end, but you can just not do that. It's fine. It's not particularly inconvenient. This is often done in coffee tasting. They'll just put the ground coffee in a bowl with some water. It's fine. So, what is common in the culture of Turkish coffee drinking? Soothsaying. Well, you can kind of read the tea leaves, but the coffee grounds instead, in your cup of coffee. And there's a saying in that culture that I'm not going to reproduce perfectly, but it was inspiring to me. It said, basically, it amounts to you should like neither avoid nor embrace soothsaying. In other words, don't try not to have fun interpreting like your coffee grounds or whatever. Just don't take it too seriously. And it's such a simple thing to express, but that idea, like, I think that my culture, or at least where I grew up, maybe that might be very, very local to me, by the way, in this case, takes things to all or nothing. You can do a little bit of something. Have some faith that people will be a little more grounded. When there's a myth told to a culture, people have a tendency to act like, did every single person believe that Zeus was up there throwing thunderbolts directly at people? Like, not yes, not no. You know what I mean? Like, I'm it depends on the person. I'm not a historian. Maybe that's wrong. But just as an example, it doesn't have to be like they either did or didn't think that thing, right? It was in between somewhere, of course. And it's the same thing with inspiration in general. It doesn't have to be that and I do think it can be harmful to directly aspire to do the exact thing that other person did. But neither is it bad to admire people who are doing the thing just because behind the scenes, honestly, it's often not that impressive. If you break down the sort of fame of a celebrity you like, for example, they behind the scenes, what they're doing is humble, often, or supported by many other factors or parties. What I do for a living is pretty simple at the end of the day. It's many, many very simple parts. It's great that it works, but I would argue that's like saying the most amazing part is you, actually, not so much me. The inspiring bit is that it works to do this for a living, like for the most part. Financially, this is a topic for another time, but more or less, that is a thing that works. My business model is more or less that people can kind of support when they feel ready to, and people kind of get all the content, all the entertainment for free. And that mostly works is inspiring. That will forever prevent me from losing any significant amount of faith in people valuing their entertainment. You all apparently do. So I that means a lot to me. Thank you. But I do think it's a relevant example. I hope you see what I mean. Shameless self-plugging aside, no, that's a relevant example. I think that the way of focusing on things as a like idolizing something is very different from just being hopeful. You could put hope on a spectrum in the middle between sort of idolizing something and being totally disillusioned, maybe. And I think like many things, it's bad to be at either extreme. You suggested at the end of the parlay that despair could be viewed as the opposite of hope. You said it's the cessation of the search for something better. And I think that is a good description. I remember watching an anime, the name of which I forget. It was weird. It didn't have a lot of direction, but the gimmick of the anime was that there was this serial killer. It wasn't really clear. That was one of the bad things about the show to me. And she would, if she spoke to people, they would lose all hope in their life. And you can imagine how that would go for them. But they basically just became completely despondent, and gave up on life. The moment that she spoke to them in any way, no matter what she said, it seemed like. I guess we didn't know exactly, but that, anyway. And it didn't seem to be magic or something. I guess it was a metaphor. That was too unclear. Let's say it that way. It was otherwise way too grounded of a show for it to be like that one person was just a metaphor for humanity, or that one person was like doing magecraft to people. No more about that show for now. But what I found interesting was to kind of escalate the tension. She eventually came into conflict with it was like the president of some country, and he was like the most hopeful person ever. He had like eternal hope. He had this inviolable ability to believe in humanity and continue. And you felt like this guy, there's no way you could make this guy lose hope. If she makes this guy lose all hope, like it's not even him anymore. It's brainwashing or magic or something, because you cannot make this guy lose all hope. That was how they depicted this guy, okay? And she spoke to him, and he did lose all hope, but didn't lose his personality. And the show completely breaks at that point for me, because it just doesn't seem logic. That's not really logically possible. If he isn't being controlled, and he does still act like himself, but he just magically suddenly loses all hope, that just doesn't really work. I don't know. Again, maybe there's some totally logical explanation, but at the time I thought this show doesn't really work. What fascinated me was that he said, as he was leaving this world behind, was that he finally understood what it meant to be human, which was to continue. He said, I thought that was rather profound for this largely ridiculous show. To be human is to continue, they said. And I think that that's an interesting way to frame hope. Is it's a more humble thing. It sounds like this broad, ridiculous construct that you can frame, you can make fun of as a myth used to motivate men to do what they cannot. Sure, sure. But reframing it as, yeah, no, that's the driving force behind people trying to improve. People are hopeful in a more mundane way. They're just willing to believe that if they get out of bed in the morning, there will be some good things. It will be mostly good. Speaking personally for a minute, I suffered from a strange, ominous dread. I don't really know how to describe this feeling for a lot of my young life. Usually how it would happen is I would lay in bed and it would be dark. And I like the nighttime. I'm very comfortable in the dark. It wasn't fear of the dark at all. But I think it was just the sort of nothingness that freaked me out or something. And I would get this very distinct feeling of dread that I wouldn't easily be able to make go away. It would feel like the room was kind of zooming out from me. And as I was lying there, unable to quickly get to sleep, it really bothered me. And even though I would say I'm not more hopeful necessarily now, like I don't think that I'm less stressed out now. I don't think that a lot of things are necessarily better logistically in this moment. The overall thrust of my life has become more about continuing, about kind of striving to do something. I never felt like my work in school, for example, meant anything to me. So I think that when I went to bed, I felt like this is just nothing. There is nothing. There isn't anything. I'm not progressing. I'm just kind of here, stagnant forever. And that was really depressing. And all that made me feel better, and I largely don't feel better, but that feeling went away, was simply attempting something. Even if it goes badly, no matter how bad I feel at the end of the day about how my work is going, I don't feel like that. Even though I might feel depressed or have low energy or be anxious, I don't feel like that. And I've always thought that was such an interesting, I guess it's not that bad, I think to myself. Not good to diminish my own struggle in this moment, but yeah, that's always fascinated me. So that's the way that I often think about hope. Um, I hope that was in haha. That was in haha. Should probably end it here. I hope that was an interesting way to tackle this question, just talk about hope stuff, bit of a personal parlay. You asked about hope. I think hope is a personal emotion from my tastes in broad chested folks of all denominations in animation versus in real life, and violent imaginations of popping off on the kalimba when street performing or whatever, to just thinking about the way in which human life is maybe defined by the way that we just chill hope out a little bit. It's not this crazy thing. It can be very mundane. We're not imagining, Poseidon having sex with your aunt and having a demigod child. It can just be, it's great to just give things a try in human life. Maybe it doesn't have to be Heracles and the 12 labors, and we can, I don't know why I'm giving examples only from Greek mythology. I hope you enjoyed this parlay. If you want to get one like it, you can check out details about how to do that in the description. But PistilWhip, thank you very much again. Have a good one, folks.